In the series of Read Aloud series, Indian Economic Development, I'm reading from here. It's a textbook for class 11th. I have finished the unit 1, which comprises of 2 chapters. The unit 1 is development policies and experience right from 1947 to 1990. And in the first chapter, we talked about Indian economy on the eve of independence. So in that we talked about all this. And then chapter 2 we talked about Indian economy 1950 to 1990. In that we talked about the goals of 5-year plans, agriculture, industry and trade, trade policies and import substitution. So now we are doing unit 2, which is economic reform since 1991, and in the unit 2 we have only one chapter, that is chapter 3, which is liberalization, privatization and globalization and appraisal. In that we are going to discuss about the background, that what is liberalization, what is privatization and what is globalization, and Indian economy during reforms and assessment. Chapter 3, liberalization, privatization and globalization and appraisal. So once we finish with the chapter, we will understand what was the background of the reform policies introduced in India in 1991, and we'll also understand the mechanism through which reform policies were introduced. And then we'll be able to understand the process of globalization and its implication for India, and we will also know about the impact of the reform process in various sectors. So I read from the introduction. You have studied in the previous chapter that since independence, India followed the mixed economy framework by combining the advantages of the capitalist economic system with those of the socialist economic system. Some scholars argue that over the years this policy resulted in the establishment of a variety of rules and laws which were aimed at controlling and regulating the economy, ended up instead in hampering the process of growth and development. Others state that India, which started its development path from near stagnation, has since been able to achieve growth in savings, developed a diversified industrial sector which produces a variety of goods and has experienced sustained expansion of agricultural output which has ensured food security. In 1991, India met with an economic crisis relating to its external debt. The government was not able to make repayments on its borrowings from abroad. Foreign exchange reserves, which we generally maintain to import petrol and other important items, dropped to levels that were not sufficient for even a fortnight. The crisis was further compounded by rising prices of essential goods. All these led the government to introduce a new set of policy measures which changed the direction of our developmental strategies. In this chapter, we will look at the background of the crisis, measures that the government has adopted, and their impact on various sectors of the economy. Let's talk about the background. So what happened? The origin of the financial crisis can be traced from the inefficient management of the Indian economy in the 1980s. We know that for implementing various policies and its general administration, the government generates funds from various sources such as taxation, running of public sector enterprises, etc. When expenditure is more than income, the government borrows to finance the deficit from banks and also from people within the country and from international financial institutions. When we import goods like petroleum, we pay in dollars, which we earn from our exports. Development policies required that even though the revenues were very low, the government had to overshoot its revenue to meet problems like unemployment, poverty, and population explosion. The continued spending on development programs of the government did not generate additional revenue. Moreover, the government was not able to generate sufficiently from internal sources such as taxation, where the government was spending a large share of its income on areas which do not provide immediate returns, such as the social sector and defense. There was a need to utilize the rest of its revenue in a highly efficient manner. The income from public sector undertakings was also not very high to meet the growing expenditure. At times, our foreign exchange borrowed from other countries and international financial institutions was spent on meeting consumption needs. Neither was an attempt made to reduce such profligate spending, nor sufficient attention was given to boost exports to pay for the growing imports. In the late 1980s, government expenditure began to exceed its revenue by such large margins that meeting the expenditure through borrowings became unsustainable. Prices of many essential goods rose sharply. Imports grew at a very high rate without matching growth of exports. As pointed out earlier, foreign exchange reserves declined to a level that was not adequate to finance imports for more than 2 weeks. There was also not sufficient foreign exchange to pay the interest that needs to be paid to international lenders. Also, no country or international funder was willing to lend to India. India approached the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, that is IBRD, popularly known as World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, that is IMF, and received $7 billion as loan to manage the crisis. For availing the loan, these international agencies expected India to liberalize and open up the economy by removing restrictions on the private sector, reduce the role of the government in many areas, and remove trade restrictions between India and other countries. India agreed to the conditionalities of the World Bank and IMF and announced the New Economic Policy, NEP. The NEP consisted of wide-ranging economic reforms. The thrust of the policies was towards creating a more competitive environment in the economy and removing the barriers to entry and growth of firms. This set of policies can broadly be classified into two groups: the stabilization measures and the structural reform measures. Stabilization measures are short-term measures intended to correct some of the weaknesses that have developed in the balance of payments and to bring inflation under control. In simple words, this means that there was a need to maintain sufficient foreign exchange reserves and keep the rising prices under control. On the other hand, structural reform policies are long-term measures aimed at improving the efficiency of the economy and increasing its international competitiveness. By removing the rigidities in various segments of the Indian economy, the government initiated a variety of policies which fall under three heads, that is liberalization, privatization, and globalization. So let's just talk about liberalization.